A routine traffic stop turned into a national reckoning when a racist cop struck Big Shaq's pregnant daughter without realizing whose legacy just got challenged. What began with a shove soon echoed through every headline, every street, and every corner of power. The cop thought it was just another body, just another name, but that bell rang louder than anyone expected. Big Shaq didn't come for revenge. Big Shaq came for justice. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The officer's fist hit her belly before his brain registered the badge name, O'Neill. It was the kind of afternoon where the city moved like clockwork, sirens humming in the distance, sunlight threading through concrete towers, horns chirping in rhythm like impatient birds. Belle O'Neill waited patiently in her car, one hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. She was 7 months along, and the baby, her first, was unusually calm that day. Maybe it sensed something. Maybe it knew the storm before it broke. She had just pulled into a curbside spot near downtown to drop off some documents for her husband's nonprofit. It should have been 10 minutes, 15 tops. Instead, a white patrol car lurched into the scene with lights flashing. No sirens, just authority written in red and blue steel. Officer Wade Sullivan, mid-30s, sharp jaw, flat eyes, stepped out like he owned the pavement. His belt sagged with power. His badge glinted like it had something to prove. "License and registration," he barked before Belle could even roll the window halfway. "Sir, may I ask? You're parked illegally." "No." She turned to gesture at the sign just feet behind the car. "It says I can park here until 3. He didn't look. He didn't need to. To him, her skin was the violation. "Step out of the vehicle." "Sir, I'm pregnant." "I said step out." Belle's hand instinctively went to her belly. "Please don't yell at me." That's when it happened. Fast. Reflexive. Like a twitch. Wade reached for the door handle, yanked it open, and in a flash of frustration, misread her movement. He shoved her away from the doorframe. The heel of his palm, deliberate or careless, landed squarely against her stomach. There was no time to register the pain before the silence cracked. Bystanders screamed. A man filming from across the street caught the officer's nameplate, and the way Belle doubled over, gasping but not crying. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She stood, dignified, her eyes glassy, fixed on Wade, who now stood frozen in realization. He hadn't seen the necklace, a small silver basketball charm glinting on her collarbone. He hadn't seen the hospital wristband from that morning's prenatal visit. He definitely hadn't seen the folder on the passenger seat bearing the name Belle O'Neill. Because if he had, he might have thought twice before touching her. But by the time Wade took a step back, it was too late. The clip hit the internet before the sirens even stopped. It spread like spilled ink. Twitter, Reddit, local news, and then national. One name surged through every post like a wave. Shaquille O'Neal. Big Shaq. The gentle giant. NBA royalty. Belle's father. Shaq had been on stage at a charity gala for underprivileged youth in Atlanta. Suited, smiling, midway through a joke when his assistant broke protocol and approached him. The phone call lasted 30 seconds. His face changed. The room changed with it. He walked off stage without apology. No explanation. Just a name mouthed under his breath. Belle. He didn't fly back. He had a driver waiting. By the time his car hit the freeway, the dashboard lit up with alerts. Photos of Belle at the scene. Headlines blaring. Pregnant black woman shoved by officer in traffic stop. Victim is Shaquille O'Neal's daughter. Shaq didn't speak during the ride. He stared out the window, jaw clenched, fingers twitching. Not because of the cameras or the headlines. Because he knew Belle. She was his fire, his center. The only one who'd ever told him he was too soft, too forgiving, too patient with a world that didn't always deserve it. And now someone had put hands on her belly on his grandchild. That wasn't a headline. That was personal. When he arrived at the hospital, Nate met him in the hallway, red-eyed and trembling. "She's stable," Nate said. "They're monitoring the baby. No bleeding, no trauma, just stress." Shaq didn't speak. He hugged Nate so hard the younger man wheezed. Then he walked into Belle's room. She sat upright, calm, refusing to show pain. She always did that, wore her pride like armor. But when she saw him, her eyes softened. Just a little. "They asked me if I wanted to press charges," she said. Shaq stepped closer, pulled up a chair, took her hand. "And? I want justice, not a settlement." His chest tightened. Not because he disagreed, but because he knew what justice cost. He'd spent a lifetime trying to insulate his kids from the ugliness he'd grown up with. Thought he could buy their way out of it. But money was paper, and racism didn't burn easy. The doctor entered a moment later, with a polite smile and cautious tone.
Al was fine.
The baby's heartbeat was strong, but stress hormones were high. They'd need to monitor her for the next 24 hours. Nothing was guaranteed, but things looked okay for now. Shaq thanked him. Then he turned to Belle again. "This won't be quiet," he said. "Good," she whispered. "Let them hear it." By the evening, reporters had staked out the hospital. Every screen flashed his face. Talk shows speculated. The police department released a vague statement about an unfortunate misunderstanding. Officer Wade Sullivan was placed on administrative leave. Belle refused to speak to the press. Nate handled the reporters like a lion pacing the gates. Shaq ignored every call except one from his mother, Lucille. "You all right?" she asked. "No," he said. There was a pause. "Then do something about it. But do it your way." He stared at the window again. Outside, the city buzzed with cars and news vans. Protesters already beginning to gather near the precinct. Signs being painted. Voices being sharpened. The sun dipped low, spilling gold across the skyline. Somewhere downtown, Officer Wade Sullivan sat alone in his apartment, watching the footage on a loop. Over and over. His face, his hand, her belly, the name, O'Neill. And somewhere deep inside, something began to crack. Back at the hospital, Shaq leaned in and kissed Belle's forehead. "Rest," he said softly. "I've got this now." And just like that, the ground beneath the city began to shift. Not with violence, not with fire, but with something far harder to contain. A father's fury in silence, a daughter's dignity in defiance, and a name too big to ignore. Shaq's heart wasn't racing for headlines. It was pounding for his unborn grandchild. Shaq stood just outside the glass doors of the emergency room, his massive frame casting a long shadow against the blinding white floor. Inside, Belle lay on a stretcher, monitors strapped to her belly, doctors speaking in clipped, precise tones. Nate hovered beside her, his hand trembling as he gripped hers, trying to be her calm, her anchor. But Shaq could see through it. He knew that kind of stillness was a mask, a paper wall about to rip. His chest felt tight, tighter than it ever did on the court, tighter than it had during any championship game or career-ending injury. He watched his daughter's face, pale, proud, still. Belle was his fighter. She'd always been. As a child, she was the one who spoke up when waiters skipped their table, when store clerks followed them, when teachers treated her differently. He thought she'd outgrown those battles. He thought maybe, just maybe, his fame had built her a shield. But standing here, watching her now, he realized the brutal truth. Money couldn't buy safety. Fame couldn't erase skin color. Not in this country. The doctor emerged, clipboard in hand, a polite smile stretched too tight. "Mr. O'Neill, the baby's heart rate is steady. No signs of trauma or internal injury. We're keeping her under observation, but for now mother and child are stable." Shaq let out a breath. He didn't know he'd been holding. He offered a quiet nod, the kind that came from decades of dealing with people who didn't know how to talk to giants, literal or figurative. He shook the doctor's hand gently, careful not to crush it. As he turned, his phone vibrated again. Another notification, another headline, another storm waiting to erupt. His publicist had texted twice. "We need a statement." News crews were gathering outside. The story had already spun beyond them, beyond truth, beyond control. He remembered a time, years ago, when Belle was 12, and he took her to a Lakers game. They were late, stuck in traffic when a cop pulled them over. Shaq had been driving. He rolled down the window, smiled, ready to be recognized. But the officer didn't look at his face. He looked at his hands, at his skin, asked him to step out, asked him why the car smelled like weed. Belle had sat there, shaking, clutching her tiny backpack. Shaq had smoothed it over then. Used charm, used fame. But that night, she'd asked him the question that haunted him. "Daddy, why didn't he see you?" And now here they were again. Another cop. Another blind eye. Another moment where being Shaq didn't matter. Shaq's jaw clenched. He rubbed a massive hand over his face, the lines in his forehead deepening. Did he go public? Stand in front of the cameras? Demand accountability? throw his weight into the fight, or did he handle it privately, through lawyers, through city officials, make it go away quietly, to protect Bell, to shield his family from the bloodthirsty churn of media frenzy? He walked to a quiet corner of the waiting room, where the hum of machines faded. His mind spun through the options. He could call the mayor. He had that number. He could call the police chief. He had that number too. But every path twisted into the same knot. None of it would erase what had been done. None of it would unshove Belle, unstrike her belly, unscare the life growing inside her. Nate approached, his face pale and drawn. "She wants to see you." Shaq nodded silently and followed him back. Inside the room, Belle lay propped up on pillows, one hand resting lightly on her belly, the other gripping the hospital blanket like a lifeline. She looked up, eyes sharp despite her exhaustion. "Dad," she said softly, "promise me you won't just make this go away." Shaq sat beside her, his massive hand dwarfing hers as he took it. "Baby, you need to rest." "I'm serious." Her voice was firm, edged with the steel he'd always admired. "Don't let them sweep this under the rug. I don't want some quiet settlement. I don't want to be a headline for a week, and then forgotten." Shaq's throat tightened. "You think I'd let that happen?" Belle's gaze softened, just a little. "I know you want to protect me, but this isn't just about me." She paused, looking down at her belly. "This is about what kind of world I'm bringing this baby into." Shaq felt the weight of her words settle on his shoulders. He'd fought so hard to build a legacy, on the court, in business, in charity. But none of it mattered if the world stayed the same. Outside the hospital, reporters were shouting questions, their voices muffled, but persistent. Cameras flashed, protesters gathered, holding signs demanding justice, demanding accountability. Shaq's phone buzzed again. Sponsors, agents, teammates, celebrities, everyone weighing in, everyone watching. He looked at Belle, at the strength in her eyes, at the quiet defiance in her posture, and he realized there was no choice. He stood, kissed her forehead gently, and said, "Rest now. I've got this." As he stepped out of the room, Nate caught his arm. "What are you going to do?" Shaq exhaled slowly, feeling the tremor of something bigger than himself rise inside. "What I should have done, a long time ago." In the hallway, the hospital administrator approached nervously. "Mr. O'Neill, the media." Shaq raised a hand, silencing him. "Clear me a room. I need to make a statement." The administrator hesitated. "Now?" Shaq's voice was calm, but his eyes burned. "Now." As he waited, Shaq scrolled through his phone. The headlines blurred, the tweets, the news alerts, the opinion pieces, all of it noise. He closed his eyes, centering himself, hearing his mother's voice in his head. "When the ground shakes, son, plant your feet." Minutes later, he stood in front of a row of microphones, hastily set up in a hospital conference room. Reporters jostled for position, their questions flying. Shaq raised a hand, and the room fell still. He looked into the cameras, his deep voice steady, measured, carrying the weight of a father, a black man, a public figure who knew the stakes. "This isn't about fame," he began. "This isn't about money. This is about a system that treats some lives as disposable. My daughter's life, my unborn grandchild's life. And I will not stand by silently." The cameras clicked. The room held its breath. Shaq continued, his words cutting through the noise. "I call on the police department to hold their own accountable. I call on the city to take a hard look at the patterns that led us here. And I call on everyone watching, parents, leaders, citizens, to stand with us. Not just today, not just this week, but until real change happens." He stepped back, his statement made, his path chosen. As the room erupted into questions, Shaq turned and walked away, his mind already on the next move, the next battle, the next quake to come. Officer Wade Sullivan thought it was just another patrol, until his badge number became a national hashtag. Wade Sullivan sat at his small kitchen table, the bitter taste of coffee clinging to his mouth, as the morning sun sliced through the blinds. His badge lay on the table beside him, glinting coldly in the light. He'd taken it off the night before, something he never did, and now he just stared at it, willing it to explain what had gone wrong. The news played softly on the TV in the corner. But it wasn't soft enough to drown out the pounding of his own thoughts. Every channel had his face plastered on it, a photo taken years ago when he'd first been sworn in. He looked younger then, hopeful even, but today his name was no longer a point of pride. It was a national hashtag, a trending topic, a symbol of everything wrong with the system he'd once sworn to serve. He closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair, the events of the day before flashing through his mind like a scratched tape. The woman's face, Belle O'Neill, her wide, stunned eyes, the way she'd instinctively clutched her belly. He hadn't known who she was in that moment. He hadn't known she was pregnant, hadn't recognized the name, hadn't connected the dots between her and the towering figure he'd seen on TV. His entire life. But ignorance didn't soften the blow. A knock at the door snapped him back to the present. Wade rose slowly, pulling his rumpled shirt into place, and opened it to find Captain Russell, his superior, standing grim-faced on the porch. Without waiting to be invited in, Russell stepped past him and shut the door. "Sit down, Wade," Russell ordered, his voice low, the kind of low that carried sharp edges. Wade obeyed, sinking back into his chair as Russell paced the small kitchen. "We're under a microscope," Russell began. "The mayor's breathing down the commissioner's neck. Internal Affairs has already opened a file, and the department's PR team is working overtime trying to control the damage." Wade ran a hand over his face. "I didn't mean to." "Doesn't matter what you meant." Russell cut him off, slamming a palm on the table. "You shoved a pregnant woman, on camera. A black woman. Shaquille O'Neal's daughter, no less. This isn't just bad press, Wade. This is a bomb under the department's feet." Wade's stomach clenched. He wanted to explain, wanted to tell Russell that he'd been following protocol, that the woman had been parked illegally, that she'd been slow to comply, that he'd felt threatened, but the words stuck in his throat. Somewhere deep down, a voice he didn't want to hear whispered, "You didn't feel threatened. You were frustrated. You were impatient. You didn't see her. You saw the stereotype." Russell leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "You keep your mouth shut. No interviews. No statements. Let the union and the lawyers handle it. Do you understand me?" Wade nodded numbly. "Yeah, I understand." But later, when the captain left, Wade sat alone at the table, staring at his badge again. The voice inside grew louder. He thought about his father, a retired cop who'd raised him on stories of good guys and bad guys, of the thin blue line. But Wade had never really questioned how narrow that line was, how easily it blurred. He'd grown up in a quiet suburb, surrounded by people who looked like him, who thought like him. His first beat had been in a predominantly white neighborhood, where traffic stops were routine and confrontations were rare. But when he'd been transferred downtown 2 years ago, things changed. The tension in the air was thicker, the neighborhoods more diverse, the calls more complicated. He'd started to notice the way some of his fellow officers spoke about certain neighborhoods, certain people. He told himself he was better than that he didn't carry those biases. But now, looking back at the footage, seeing himself on that screen, the sharpness in his voice, the impatience in his movements, he wasn't so sure anymore. His phone buzzed on the table. Another notification, another headline, another angry comment. He scrolled through social media, seeing his name dragged through the mud, seeing strangers demand his badge, his job, his freedom. Part of him wanted to throw the phone across the room, but another part, the part that was cracking open, kept reading. That evening, Wade reported to the station for a mandatory internal meeting. The atmosphere was suffocating. Other officers gave him tight-lipped nods or avoided his gaze altogether. No one said much. In the conference room, a representative from Internal Affairs laid out the process: investigation, suspension, hearings. Wade sat stiffly, absorbing every word, feeling the ground shift under his feet. After the meeting, as he walked to his car, he overheard 2 fellow officers whispering nearby. "Guy's cooked. No coming back from this." "Yeah, but it's just bad luck. Wrong person, wrong time. Could have been any of us." Wade froze. Could it have? Was it really just bad luck? Or was it something deeper, something rotting in the bones of the job? Driving home, Wade's mind raced. His hands gripped the wheel tighter than they should have. He thought about Belle O'Neill, about her father, about the growing protests, the signs calling for justice, the voices demanding change. He thought about the kids he'd passed on the street in his uniform, the wary looks, the flinches, the mothers pulling their children a little closer. By the time he pulled into his driveway, a decision had begun to take shape in his mind. It wasn't clear yet, but it was there, rising like a distant storm. He stepped inside, closed the door, and sat back down at the kitchen table. The badge still sat there, cold and silent. For the first time in his life, Wade wondered if wearing it had ever truly meant serving justice, or if it had just meant protecting the people who wore the same badge. And for the first time, he wasn't sure which side he was on. The networks didn't just want a headline, they wanted a war. Shaq sat at the long, polished table in the back room of the hospital, his massive hands folded tightly, knuckles pale. Across from him, his publicist, Mel Carter, clicked through a stream of incoming calls and messages, her phone lighting up like a Christmas tree. She was sharp, no nonsense, dressed in a tailored suit that said she was ready for war. But even she looked rattled now. "Shaq, you need to say something," she urged, her voice low but urgent. "The media cycle's turning savage. We've got CNN, MSNBC, Good Morning America, ESPN. They all want interviews. Every outlet wants a quote, a soundbite, a stance. You can't go silent." Shaq leaned back, exhaling slowly. His mind was a storm. Belle's pale face, Nate's haunted eyes, the soft thump of his unborn grandchild's heartbeat on the monitor. He wasn't thinking about sponsors or headlines. He was thinking about his family, about the way the world wanted to devour their pain and spit it out as entertainment. "I'm not giving them a performance," he muttered, his deep voice edged with steel. "This isn't a highlight reel." Mel pinched the bridge of her nose. "It doesn't matter what you want it to be, Shaq. It's already a national firestorm. You can shape the narrative, or they'll shape it for you." Out in the main hallway, Belle sat propped up in her hospital bed, her phone in hand. Nate hovered protectively nearby, checking the window, keeping an eye on the press vans parked outside. Belle scrolled through her feed, heart hammering. Video clips looped over and over. Her body, her face, the officer's shove, the impact, her name, trending worldwide. Some posts were messages of love and support. Others were darker, people calling her names, questioning the story, casting doubt. Trolls swarmed, demanding attention, stirring anger. But Belle's fingers didn't tremble as she read. She'd been raised under the public eye. She knew how fast the internet could twist reality. What rattled her wasn't the strangers. It was the fear that her family would fold under the pressure, take the easy out, and let the system walk away untouched. In the streets below, a growing crowd began to form. Protesters carrying signs, chanting for justice, holding Belle's name high. Some were seasoned activists, passionate and organized, but mixed in were agitators, opportunists, looking to stir chaos. Tension buzzed in the air like static before a storm. Police units lined up at the edge of the crowd, eyes sharp, hands hovering near radios. Inside City Hall, the mayor and her chief of staff watched the footage play on loop. The mayor, a polished woman in her 50s with sharp features and sharper instincts, paced the room. "If Shaquille O'Neal goes full public on this, we've got a nightmare on our hands. We can't have a citywide protest spiral out of control. Not after last year." Her chief of staff, a wiry man named Dean, adjusted his glasses nervously. "We could reach out quietly, offer a settlement, some kind of partnership on community programs. Give him a win. Give us a win. Keep it out of the streets." The mayor shot him a glance. "You think you can handle Shaq with a checkbook? He's not some rookie athlete who needs hush money. This is personal for him." Back at the hospital, Mel placed her phone down, exhaling sharply. "They're offering you a primetime interview slot. National address. Full control over the message. We can frame this however you want. Family tragedy, public safety, systemic change. You just need to pick your angle." Shaq shook his head slowly. "This isn't a campaign, Mel. This is my daughter. This is my grandchild." He stood towering over the room, his presence filling the space. "If I speak my truth. Not a sanitized statement. Not a curated image." Mel hesitated. "You know, once you go out there, there's no pulling back, right? You'll set something in motion you can't control." Shaq looked out the window, watching the crowd swell below, hearing the distant chants rise like a drumbeat. He saw Belle's face in his mind, her determination, her defiance. He saw his own face reflected in glass, a man who'd spent decades building a reputation, only to realize that reputation couldn't protect the people he loved. He turned back to Mel, his voice quiet but firm. "I was born in Newark. I know what this fight is. I've been lucky to outrun it for a while. But it always catches up. It's caught up now." Meanwhile, in a downtown precinct, Officer Wade Sullivan sat in a cramped office, eyes locked on the same newsfeed. His hands trembled as he watched the protests grow. The headlines shift. The public fury sharpened like a blade. His superior walked by, giving him a cold glance. "Stay out of the press," he warned gruffly. "Keep your mouth shut. Let the union do its job." But Wade's mind was spinning. The cracks in his certainty were widening. He kept seeing Belle's face, her eyes wide with shock, her hands on her belly. He kept hearing the protests, the demands, the questions no one at the station wanted to answer. Back at the hospital, Shaq stepped into Belle's room, the air heavy with unspoken tension. She looked up at him, her expression tired but fierce. "You're not backing down, are you?" she asked softly. He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Never." Nate stood by the window, watching the protests intensify. "They're waiting for you out there," he said quietly. Shaq placed a hand gently on Belle's shoulder. "You rest. I've got work to do." As he left the room, Mel hurried to his side, whispering final instructions, media tips, talking points. Shaq barely heard her. His focus was already locked on the bigger picture. The weight of his family, his name, his community, all of it pressing down on him, demanding action. He stepped outside the hospital, the roar of the crowd hitting him like a wave. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. Protesters cheered as he raised a hand, calling for calm. He could feel the eyes of the city, the nation, the world on him. And somewhere deep inside he understood. This wasn't just about his daughter anymore. This was about every father, every mother, every child who'd been shoved aside, silenced, ignored. This was about a system built on looking away, and a moment that refused to be looked away from. The furnace was lit, and Shaq, standing tall in the flames, was ready to walk through it. Ghosts of Lucille's past, 1,100 words. Lucille O'Neill had seen the beast of racism, long before her son wore his first jersey. Lucille O'Neill sat quietly in her living room, the phone resting in her lap, the TV flickering across the room with endless footage of her son. Every channel, every reporter, every camera seemed to be fixed on Shaquille, not as a basketball legend, not as a celebrity, but as a father standing at the edge of a national firestorm. She reached for the remote, muted the noise, and closed her eyes for a moment, letting memory tug her backward. She could still see the small Newark apartment, where she raised Shaq, the peeling wallpaper, the drafty windows, the sound of sirens always close by. Back then it was just her and her son against the world. She'd worked long shifts, sometimes 2 or 3 jobs, doing whatever it took to keep food on the table, and her boy off the streets. She remembered the way neighbors warned her. "That boy is going to be too big, too loud, too fast. They'll come after him." And they had. Even before Shaq picked up a basketball, Lucille had known what the world saw when they looked at her son. Not a child but a threat. Not a promise but a problem. She'd fought tooth and nail to keep him grounded, to teach him dignity, patience, restraint, because she knew that one wrong move, one misunderstanding, could end everything. Now, decades later, that same fear gripped her heart. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. She answered, and her son's deep voice rumbled through the line. "Mama," Shaq said softly, "I don't know if I can fix this." Lucille smiled faintly, leaning back in her chair. "Baby, you were never meant to fix it." Shaq sighed on the other end. "They want me to make a statement to smooth things over, to calm the city down. But Belle's angry, Nate's angry, I'm angry. And the system, it doesn't want change, Mama. It just wants quiet." Lucille's voice softened, but her words carried weight. "Son, you think this is about fame, about statements. This is about survival. It's about making sure Belle's baby doesn't grow up fighting the same fights we did." Shaq fell silent. Lucille's mind drifted again, back to a night when Shaq was 16, tall and broad-shouldered, already drawing attention just by existing. He'd been walking home from a friend's house when a patrol car pulled up, 2 white officers stepping out, questioning him, accusing him of looking suspicious. Lucille had run down the street barefoot when a neighbor called her, heart pounding, voice shaking, terrified they'd hurt her boy. She remembered grabbing his arm, pulling him close, standing between him and the officers, like a human shield. She'd shouted, pleaded, demanded they back off, and by some miracle, they had. But the memory of it never left her. "Mama," Shaq murmured on the phone. "What if I make things worse?" Lucille's laugh was soft, bittersweet. "Worse, baby? Look around. It's already worse. The only question is whether you stand up or stand aside." At the hospital, Shaq sat in a quiet corner, his phone still pressed to his ear, His eyes were tired, shoulders heavy, heart pulled in 1,000 directions. He wanted to protect Belle, protect the family name, protect the peace, but Lucille's words echoed in his head, cutting through the noise. This wasn't about his reputation. This wasn't about cleaning up a scandal. This was about what kind of man he was, what kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind. As he ended the call, he felt a shift inside, a slow, deep certainty replacing the gnawing uncertainty. He stood, squared his shoulders, and walked back toward Belle's room. Inside, Belle sat upright, her expression sharpened by exhaustion. Nate leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching the news on his phone. When Shaq entered, they both looked up.
Belle raised an eyebrow. "You okay, Dad?"
Shaq gave a small smile. "I just talked to your grandmother." Belle's face softened. She knew how much Lucille's words carried weight in their family. And Shaq took a deep breath. "And I think we need to stop worrying about damage control." Nate stepped forward. "What does that mean?" Shaq looked between them, his gaze steady. "It means we stop playing their game. No more quiet meetings, no more polished statements. We tell the truth, loud, public, unfiltered." Belle's eyes glistened, pride flickering behind the fatigue. "I'm with you." Nate gave a firm nod. "Me too." Meanwhile, across town, Lucille sat back in her chair, a quiet satisfaction warming her chest. She'd fought her whole life to keep her family safe, to shield them from the worst of the world. But there came a time when shielding wasn't enough, when you had to stand up, stare the beast in the face, and dare it to come closer. She turned the TV back on, watching the coverage unfold, her son's face filling the screen. He wasn't a boy anymore. He was a father, a leader, a man with the power to shake the system, and Lucille knew, deep down, that no matter how this ended, Shaq had already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. As night fell, the protests grew louder, the crowd swelling, the tension mounting. Shaq's PR team scrambled to manage the storm, but Shaq himself was calm, focused, resolute. He wasn't just fighting for Belle, he was fighting for Lucille, for every lesson she'd drilled into him, for every night she'd stayed up worrying, for every time she'd stood between him and a world that wanted to crush him before he could rise. In the dark, Lucille whispered a quiet prayer, not for peace, but for strength, for the storm ahead, for the fight her family was about to step into, and for the hope that maybe, just maybe, this time the beast would blink first. Lucille O'Neill had seen the beast of racism long before her son wore his first jersey. Lucille O'Neill sat quietly in her living room, the phone resting in her lap, the TV flickering across the room with endless footage of her son. Every channel, every reporter, every camera seemed to be fixed on Shaquille, not as a basketball legend, not as a celebrity, but as a father standing at the edge of a national firestorm. She reached for the remote, muted the noise, and closed her eyes for a moment, letting memory tug her backward. She could still see the small Newark apartment, where she raised Shaq, the peeling wallpaper, the drafty windows, the sound of sirens always close by. Back then it was just her and her son, against the world. She'd worked long shifts, sometimes 2 or 3 jobs, doing whatever it took to keep food on the table, and her boy off the streets. She remembered the way neighbors warned her, "That boy's gonna be too big, too loud, too fast, they'll come after him." And they had. Even before Shaq picked up a basketball, Lucille had known what the world saw when they looked at her son. Not a child, but a threat. Not a promise, but a problem. She'd fought tooth and nail to keep him grounded, to teach him dignity, patience, restraint, because she knew that one wrong move, one misunderstanding, could end everything. Now, decades later, that same fear gripped her heart. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. She answered, and her son's deep voice rumbled through the line. "Mama," Shaq said softly, "I don't know if I can fix this." Lucille smiled faintly, leaning back in her chair. "Baby, you were never meant to fix it." Shaq sighed on the other end. "They want me to make a statement, to smooth things over, to calm the city down. But Belle's angry. Nate's angry. I'm angry. And the system, it doesn't want change, Mama. It just wants quiet." Lucille's voice softened, but her words carried weight. "Son, you think this is about fame? About statements? This is about survival. It's about making sure Belle's baby doesn't grow up fighting the same fights we did." Shaq fell silent. Lucille's mind drifted again, back to a night when Shaq was 16, tall and broad-shouldered, already drawing attention just by existing. He'd been walking home from a friend's house when a patrol car pulled up. Two white officers stepping out, questioning him, accusing him of looking suspicious. Lucille had run down the street barefoot when a neighbor called her, heart pounding, voice shaking, terrified they'd heard her voice. She remembered grabbing his arm, pulling him close, standing between him and the officers like a human shield. She'd shouted, pleaded, demanded they back off, and by some miracle they had, but the memory of it never left her. "Mama," Shaq murmured on the phone. "What if I make things worse?" Lucille's laugh was soft, bittersweet. "Worse, baby. Look around. It's already worse. The only question is whether you stand up or stand aside." At the hospital, Shaq sat in a quiet corner, his phone still pressed to his ear. His eyes were tired, shoulders heavy, heart pulled in 1,000 directions. He wanted to protect Belle, protect the family name, protect the peace. But Lucille's words echoed in his head, cutting through the noise. This wasn't about his reputation. This wasn't about cleaning up a scandal. This was about what kind of man he was, what kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind. As he ended the call, he felt a shift inside, a slow, deep certainty replacing the gnawing uncertainty. He stood, squared his shoulders, and walked back toward Belle's room. Inside, Belle sat upright, her expression sharpened by exhaustion. Nate leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching the news on his phone. When Shaq entered, they both looked up. Belle raised an eyebrow. "You okay, Dad?" Shaq gave a small smile. "I just talked to your grandmother." Belle's face softened. She knew how much Lucille's words carried weight in their family. And Shaq took a deep breath. "And I think we need to stop worrying about damage control." Nate stepped forward. "What does that mean?" Shaq looked between them, his gaze steady. "It means we stop playing their game. No more quiet meetings, no more polished statements. We tell the truth. Loud, public, unfiltered." Belle's eyes glistened, pride flickering behind the fatigue. "I'm with you." Nate gave a firm nod. "Me too." Meanwhile, across town, Lucille sat back in her chair, a quiet satisfaction warming her chest. She'd fought her whole life to keep her family safe, to shield them from the worst of the world. But there came a time when shielding wasn't enough, when you had to stand up, stare the beast in the face, and dare it to come closer. She turned the TV back on, watching the coverage unfold, her son's face filling the screen. He wasn't a boy anymore. He was a father, a leader, a man with the power to shake the system. And Lucille knew deep down that no matter how this ended, Shaq had already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. As night fell, the protests grew louder, the crowds swelling, the tension mounting. Shaq's PR team scrambled to manage the storm, but Shaq himself was calm, focused, resolute. He wasn't just fighting for Belle. He was fighting for Lucille, for every lesson she'd drilled into him, for every night she'd stayed up worrying, for every time she'd stood between him and a world that wanted to crush him before he could rise. In the dark, Lucille whispered a quiet prayer, not for peace, but for strength, for the storm ahead, for the fight her family was about to step into, and for the hope that maybe, just maybe, this time the beast would blink first. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon is a microphone, not a fist. The city had gone breathless. Outside City Hall, cameras lined the steps, microphones stacked on podiums like weapons waiting to be fired. News trucks clogged the plaza, reporters jostled for space, and protesters filled the square, holding signs that glowed under the streetlights. Justice for Belle, protect black mothers, no more silence. Shaq stood inside the grand hall, his broad shoulders wrapped in a sleek gray suit, his face composed but shadowed by the storm behind his eyes. Mel, his publicist, paced at his side, checking her phone, her voice tight. "Remember, Shaq, don't go off script. Hit the points we practiced, stay focused." Shaq gave her a steady look. "I'll speak my truth." Mel opened her mouth to protest, but something in his expression silenced her. He wasn't just an athlete stepping into the media spotlight. He was a father, a man whose family had been wounded in broad daylight, a man who understood that his words tonight weren't just headlines, they were battle lines. Outside, the crowd's chants rose as Shaq stepped onto the podium. The flash of cameras hit him like a wall, but he didn't flinch. He leaned toward the microphone, his deep voice carrying over the crowd, the media, the city. "I'm here tonight not as a celebrity," he began, his voice calm but fierce. "Not as a businessman, not as an entertainer. I'm here as a father." The square fell into an uneasy hush. My daughter, Belle O'Neill, was shoved by a police officer in what should have been a routine traffic stop. She's pregnant, she's hurt, and she's scared. But let me be clear, this isn't just about Belle. This is about every mother, every father, every child who has been told by this system that their lives are worth less. Inside the crowd, protesters murmured. Reporters leaned in, and across the city, televisions flickered to life in living rooms, bars, and break rooms. I'm not here to call for anger, Shaq continued, his eyes sweeping the crowd. I'm here to call for accountability, for reform, for a city that refuses to hide behind excuses, that refuses to protect the badge over the people. This is not a war. This is a reckoning. In a small apartment downtown, Officer Wade Sullivan sat alone on his couch, watching Shaq's speech. His badge sat on the table in front of him, cold and heavy. He heard Shaq's words cut through the air, words that cracked something inside him. He thought about his training, about the silent rules he'd learned, when to push, when to let slide, who to watch, who to overlook. He thought about Belle's face when he'd shoved her, the shock, the betrayal, the unspoken question in her eyes. Why me? And Wade realized he had no good answer. Back at City Hall, Shaq's voice deepened, his fists tightening on the podium. I have spent my life believing in this city, in its potential, in its people, but belief is not enough. We need change. We need policies that protect lives, not just reputations. We need officers held accountable, not after a tragedy, but before one. From a window high above the square, city official Dean Barrett watched with narrowed eyes. He turned to the mayor, pacing behind him, her expression tight with worry. We can't let this blow up, Dean muttered. If Shaq keeps pushing, if the protests escalate, the whole administration's at risk. We've kept complaints buried for years. We've got settlements on the books no one knows about. If this cracks open, it'll all come pouring out. The mayor crossed her arms. We need to contain this. Fast. Dean's mind raced. Quiet offers. Back-channel deals. Leverage. Anything to pull the reins before the city spun out of control. He knew the game. Control the narrative. Control the power. But Shaq was making that impossible. Down on the podium, Shaq pressed forward, his voice unwavering. This isn't about tearing down the police. It's about building something better. It's about ensuring that my grandchild, and yours, can walk these streets without fear. We are better than this. We have to be. The crowd erupted in cheers, the chants swelling, fists raised in solidarity. Reporters shouted questions, flashes strobed across the plaza, but Shaq simply stepped back, gave a small nod, and walked off the stage, his message delivered, his stand made. Backstage, Mel caught up with him, eyes wide. Shaq, that was real, he finished softly. That was real. Across the city, Wade sat frozen, the TV screen reflecting in his hollow eyes. He felt a knot tighten in his chest, a knot he couldn't ignore anymore. He'd followed orders, kept his head down, believed he was one of the good guys, but now, faced with the mirror of Shaq's words, he saw himself differently. He saw the cracks, the rot, the complicity, and for the first time, he wondered if he had the courage to step out of the shadows. At City Hall, Dean made a call. His voice clipped. We need to get ahead of this. Find out what O'Neill's next move is. Leak something if we have to. Dig up dirt. Discredit the story. We cannot let this become a crusade. But even as he spoke, the energy in the streets shifted. The city wasn't waiting for permission. The people had found a voice, a cause, a figure to rally behind. That night, as the crowds marched peacefully through downtown, candles flickering in the night, Shaq watched from Belle's hospital room window, his heart heavy but resolute. Belle rested quietly, her hand on her belly, Nate beside her, the two of them wrapped in the uncertain calm after the storm. Shaq knew the fight was far from over. He knew there were forces already moving against them, systems already working to quiet the noise, to bury the truth. But he also knew something had shifted. The city had heard him, the country had heard him, and there was no turning back. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon wasn't a fist, or a gun, or a threat. Sometimes it was a voice. And Shaquille O'Neal was done being silent. In the quiet halls of power, deals are made that never see daylight. In the hushed interior of City Hall, Dean Barrett adjusted his tie, his thin lips pressed tight as he studied the prepared documents on the polished table. A discreet settlement offer, wrapped in careful legal language, dressed in concern, but beneath the surface, it was pure survival. The mayor, seated across from him, drummed her manicured nails on the tabletop. We can't let this turn into a full-blown investigation. If Shaquille takes this to the next level, the department's entire handling of complaints will get dragged into the light. She leaned forward, voice low. Get him to take the deal, Dean. Quiet money, quiet result. Across town, Shaq sat in Belle's hospital room. His massive hands clasped together, elbows resting on his knees. His eyes were shadowed, reflecting the weight of the last few days. Belle lay against her pillows, her phone in hand, eyes darting over the messages from supporters, journalists, and activists flooding her inbox. Nate moved around the room restlessly, glancing out the window at the growing protest crowd gathered below. When Shaq's phone vibrated, he knew before answering. He knew it wouldn't be just a conversation. Dean's voice came through smooth, rehearsed. Mr. O'Neill, the mayor appreciates everything you've done to keep the situation calm. We want to help bring this to a resolution that benefits everyone. Your family, the city, the police department. Shaq closed his eyes, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Say what you mean, Dean. There was a pause. We're prepared to offer a private settlement, significant compensation. In exchange, we'd hope you'd make a public statement supporting de-escalation and trust in the city's investigation. It would help the city heal, Shaq. Help your family move forward peacefully. Peace. That word lodged like a stone in Shaq's chest. He glanced at Belle, who was still scrolling, face unreadable. He knew what this was. Hush money, a neat bow tied around a messy wound. Take the payout. Smooth the narrative. Avoid systemic exposure. Protect his family's privacy at the cost of silencing the fight. He ended the call without giving an answer. That night, when the hospital room quieted, Belle turned to Nate, her voice low. We can't let him carry this alone. She gripped her phone tighter. I've been in touch with the Stonewall Collective, the grassroots civil rights group. They're organizing on the ground, pushing for independent investigations, pressuring the city to open the records. She met Nate's gaze firmly. We can't just let this become about Dad negotiating in back rooms. This has to be about all of us. Nate hesitated. Are you sure you want to stir it up more? You're still recovering, Belle. I'm sure. Her eyes flashed with determination. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about the city, the people marching outside, the mothers who don't have a famous dad to stand in front of them. Meanwhile, Shaq sat alone in a private waiting room, elbows on the table, head in his hands. His mind tugged in two directions: protect his daughter, shield her from the ugliness that would come if they pushed harder, or let the fire spread, let the system burn, knowing it might scorch them too. He thought of Lucille, of the sacrifices she'd made, of the lessons she'd drilled into him. He thought of Belle's childhood, of the promises he'd made to keep her safe, the world he'd tried to shape for her. And he thought of the baby, his unborn grandchild, the next generation staring down the same fights. Suddenly, the door creaked open. Belle stood there, pale but resolute, with Nate hovering protectively behind her. We need to talk, Belle said simply. Shaq rose quickly, concern etched across his face. You should be resting. Belle shook her head. I've been resting my whole life while people like you carried the weight. It's my turn, Dad. She stepped into the room, her voice steady despite the faint tremor in her hands. I'm not just someone to be protected. I'm part of this. Shaq looked at her, pride and fear warring in his chest. I just want to keep you safe, baby. Belle softened, reaching out to touch his arm. I know, but safety without justice isn't safety. It's just silence. For a long moment, they stood there, the air heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, Shaq gave a slow nod. All right, he said quietly. We do this together. Meanwhile, across the city, Dean paced his office, the settlement papers untouched on his desk. What's the holdup? He barked into the phone. We offered him everything. What's he waiting for? On the other end, a city aide answered nervously. He's not responding, sir. His daughter's connecting with activists. There's talk they might push for a full public investigation, demands for department records. Dean's face darkened. Then we shut it down. Leak something. Discredit the activists. Smear the family. Whatever it takes. We bury this before it buries us. But even as he plotted, the city buzzed with a different energy. Outside the hospital, the crowd of protesters had grown, candles flickering in the dark, voices raised, not in rage but in resolve. Inside, Shaq, Belle, and Nate sat together, their hands joined, their plan taking shape. They wouldn't take the hush money. They wouldn't step back. They would demand the investigation, demand the records, demand the truth, no matter how high the cost. For the first time in his life, Shaq felt something shift deep inside. He wasn't just a father protecting his child. He was a leader standing on the edge of change. A man ready to step into a fight that had been waiting for him his entire life. And in the quiet halls of power where deals were made and buried, a storm was rising that no backroom offer could stop. The badge weighed heavier when you finally saw what it stood for. Wade Sullivan sat alone in the precinct locker room, the hum of overhead lights filling the empty space. His badge lay on the bench beside him, gleaming in the harsh fluorescent glow. He'd worn it for years, felt its weight on his chest, drawn comfort from its authority. But tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt heavy, not with pride but with shame. The echo of Shaq's speech still rang in his head. He'd watched it live, glued to his television like half the city, unable to turn away as Shaquille O'Neal, the man whose daughter he'd shoved, whose family he'd shaken, called not for vengeance, but for justice, for accountability. Wade had expected anger, threats, maybe even riots. What he hadn't expected was the mirror Shaq had held up, forcing him to look hard at the reflection staring back. And he didn't like what he saw. He'd always thought of himself as one of the good guys. He wasn't the kind of cop who used slurs, who looked for fights, who went looking to rough someone up. But he was the kind of cop who stayed silent when others did. He was the kind of cop who let small injustices slide, telling himself it wasn't his business, it wasn't his place. He was the kind of cop who thought following the rules was enough, until he saw that sometimes the rules were the problem. Wade ran a hand over his face, his heart pounding. His phone buzzed. A text from another officer. "Stay strong, man. We got your back." Union's handling it. He stared at the screen. Did they have his back? Or were they just holding the line, keeping the wall intact, making sure no one saw what was cracking underneath? The doubts grew louder in his head. That night, Wade found himself at his small apartment, sitting in front of his computer, the city outside his window alive with protests, chants, the roar of a public that was no longer willing to look away. He opened the internal files, the complaint records, the case logs. He'd always told himself they were exaggerated, the misconduct reports, the complaints that never went anywhere, the community members who said they'd been mistreated. But scrolling through the records now, Wade saw a pattern too clear to deny. Officers with repeated complaints, all swept aside, incidents buried under paperwork, community concerns dismissed before they reached daylight. And he saw his own name, his own record, not a villain, but not a hero either. Complicit, silent. His hands trembled as he clicked through the files. His mind raced. If he leaked this, he'd destroy his career. Maybe his life. The department would come after him. The union would bury him. His fellow officers would brand him a traitor. But if he stayed silent, he'd carry this weight forever. Wade exhaled sharply, his heart hammering in his chest. He made his decision. He copied the files carefully, methodically, encrypting them, sending them to a trusted civil rights group anonymously. He attached no name, no explanation, just the raw data, years of complaints, evidence of bias, proof of systemic. He hit send, and in that moment, something inside him shattered and remade itself all at once. The next morning, the city woke to a bombshell. News outlets exploded with headlines. Leaked police files reveal suppressed complaints, systemic bias. Activists took to the streets, their demands now backed by proof. Protesters grew louder, stronger, more unified. The mayor's office scrambled, holding emergency meetings. The police department went into lockdown, issuing statements of denial, promising thorough investigations, while behind the scenes, panic spread. And Wade? Wade sat in his apartment, his phone turned off, his blinds drawn, the weight of his choice crashing down on him. He knew it wouldn't take long for them to trace the leak back. He'd been careful, but not careful enough. Someone would figure it out. The question wasn't if, it was when. At the precinct, whispers spread like wildfire. Someone inside flipped, "There's a rat among us," who leaked the files. Wade kept his head down, his chest tight, his every nerve on edge. He could feel the eyes on him, the unspoken suspicions. He knew the walls were closing in. But even as fear clawed at him, another feeling stirred, relief. For the first time he wasn't just wearing the badge, he was living up to it. Across the city, Shaq and Belle watched the news unfold from the hospital room. Belle's face lit up with fierce satisfaction. "Someone on the inside cracked," she murmured, scrolling through the reports. Nate stood behind her, his brow furrowed. "They're going to fight back hard," he warned. Shaq nodded slowly, his mind racing. He knew how the system worked. He knew it wouldn't fall quietly. But now, the cracks were visible. Now, the fight was on. Open ground. Meanwhile, in Dean Barrett's office, the mood was explosive. "We have to shut this down," Dean barked, slamming a fist on his desk. "Find the leak. Discredit the data. We cannot let this story keep growing." But the genie was out of the bottle. And Wade Sullivan, sitting alone in his small apartment, waiting for the knock he knew would come, felt a strange, sharp clarity cut through his fear. For once he'd done the right thing, not for himself, not for his career, but for the truth. The badge on his dresser gleamed faintly in the lamplight. It had never felt heavier, but for the first time he understood why. Protests don't just shake streets, they shake souls. The sun hung low over the city, casting long golden streaks over the rooftops. As chants rose up like waves, blocks away, crowds stretched as far as the eye could see. Thousands of people shoulder to shoulder, signs raised high, voices braided together in a relentless, pulsing chorus. Justice for Belle. End the cover-ups. No more silence. Shaq stood near the front, a towering figure in the sea of people, his arm protectively around Belle, who, despite the strain and exhaustion, had insisted on marching. Her other hand rested gently on her belly, a quiet promise to the life she was carrying. Nate walked on her other side, watchful, steady, their small family unit at the heart of a swelling, unstoppable movement. Around them, tension crackled in the air. Peaceful protesters chanted and drummed, their energy fierce but controlled. But on the edges, agitators had crept in, masked figures whispering of escalation, shouting provocations at the police line holding the perimeter. The police stood rigid, helmets gleaming, batons at their belts, radios crackling with nervous updates. Shaq could feel the weight of it pressing from all sides, the anger, the hope, the fear, the possibility that everything could tip with just one wrong word, one wrong move. He took a deep breath, grounding himself. He wasn't here as a celebrity today. He was here as a father, as a man, as a symbol of something larger. He raised his arms, his deep voice booming through the crowd, without a mic. "We are here for justice, not destruction. We stand together, not divided." The crowd rippled, the agitation at the edges faltering, the chant shifting back to unity. Belle looked up at her father, pride softening her weary features. She squeezed his arm gently, and Shaq met her gaze, feeling his purpose steal inside him. At City Hall, Dean Barrett stormed into the mayor's office, red-faced, a folder clutched in his hand. "They've got the leak. The media is running wild with the files. The activists are demanding a formal hearing. The oversight board is calling an emergency session, and the protesters are outside in force. We have to move, Madam Mayor, or we're done." The mayor sat still, watching the live footage on her office screen. Shaq in the middle of the march, calm but unyielding, his voice carrying even through the muffled speakers. Her fingers tapped the desk slowly. Dean slammed the folder down. "We need to issue a statement, pin this on the officer. Shut the investigation before it pulls the department apart. We can't survive this level of exposure. If they get the internal records into the hands of the federal oversight, we're talking about resignations, yours, mine, the commissioner's, and worse." But the mayor shook her head slowly. "It's too late to cover this. It's out of our hands now." Outside, the march pushed forward, the crowd swelling as more people poured in from side streets and sidewalks, ordinary citizens who had been watching from their windows, now stepping into the streets, store owners, teachers, students, parents, the city's heartbeat pulsing together. Shaq kept the front steady, his presence anchoring the movement. He saw flashes of the masked agitators trying again to spark clashes, saw the tense faces of the officers holding the line. He moved forward, placing himself between the crowd and the police, his voice clear and commanding. "No one here is your enemy. We demand justice, but we do it with dignity." Behind him, Belle's eyes filled with tears. She had never seen her father like this. Not on the court, not on the red carpet, not even at family gatherings. This was him at his purest. Not the legend, not the millionaire, but the man who had spent his whole life carrying his family's hope on his back, now carrying the weight of a city. Suddenly, a ripple of movement ran through the crowd as reporters pushed forward, shouting urgent updates. The leaked files were everywhere now. News stations were running exposés. Social media feeds were exploding with details from the internal complaints, the patterns of misconduct, the buried reports, the systemic failures. The shadowy efforts to suppress the evidence had collapsed in the light of public scrutiny. Dean Barrett stood frozen in his office, staring at his phone as headlines scrolled past faster than he could read. His world, his carefully managed web of control, was unraveling thread by thread. His mouth went dry. "We've lost it," he whispered. "It's gone." At the march, cheers suddenly surged through the crowd as people read the news on their phones, shouted updates to each other, felt the shift ripple through the protest. The chant changed, louder, sharper. "Accountability now. Accountability now." Shaq turned to Bell, his eyes shining with fierce, restrained triumph. "We're not done yet," he murmured, "but we're breaking through." The police line shifted, commanders conferring nervously, the tension lowering ever so slightly as the shape of the moment changed. This was no longer just a protest, it was a reckoning. As night fell, the city's skyline gleamed under a canopy of stars, the marchers holding candles and flashlights, their light washing over the streets in a river of gold. Shaq stood tall, his arm around Bell, feeling the power of the collective, the sense that something real, something lasting, had cracked open in the city's heart. Back at the precinct, Wade Sullivan sat quietly in the locker room, listening to the sounds outside. The march, the chants, the city shaking itself awake. His hands trembled slightly, but for once the fear wasn't winning. He had made his choice. He had helped crack the door open. Now it was up to the people to push it wide. At City Hall, the mayor stepped up to the microphone for a late-night statement. Her voice, once controlled and calculated, now carried a tone of forced humility. "We hear the demands of the public. We commit to a full, independent investigation. We will work with community leaders and national oversight to ensure accountability." The crowd outside roared in response. And in the middle of it all, Shaq closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the vibrations under his feet, the heartbeat of a city that was no longer willing to be quiet. Protests didn't just shake streets, they shook souls. And tonight the ground was shaking. A single strike on one woman's belly rang through the entire nation. The city had calmed, but it hadn't gone quiet. Days after the marches, the headlines still roared, but now the tone had shifted. Where there had been outrage, there was now reckoning. Where there had been silence, there were now conversations. In city halls, classrooms, coffee shops, living rooms, Bell O'Neill's name had become more than a headline. It had become a symbol, and behind it all stood Shaquille O'Neal, not as the towering athlete the world had long known, but as the voice that helped turn a spark into a flame of change. In the hospital room, sunlight streamed through the window as Belle cradled her newborn daughter, a small bundle wrapped in soft pink, her tiny fingers curling instinctively around Belle's thumb. Nate sat at her side, his hand resting on Belle's knee, his eyes tired but glowing with wonder. Across the room, Shaq stood silently, watching them with a gaze so full of love, it softened every sharp line in his face. "She's strong," Belle whispered, her voice a mix of exhaustion and awe. "She came into this world like she knew she had work to do." Shaq gave a deep, soft laugh, stepping closer to gently brush a finger along the baby's cheek. "You named her yet?" Belle exchanged a glance with Nate, then smiled. "Lucille. After Grandma. She's the reason we made it this far." Shaq's eyes misted. He thought of his mother, who had weathered storms of her own, who had given him the foundation he now stood on. "Lucille," he echoed quietly. "That's perfect." But outside the warmth of the hospital room, the world was shifting. Officer Wade Sullivan, sitting in a small, unremarkable apartment on the city's edge, watched the news unfold with a hollow sort of relief. The department's investigation was in full swing. Suspensions had been issued, lawsuits were piling up, and Wade, the man whose shove had set the dominoes falling, had formally come forward, identifying himself as the whistleblower behind the leaked files. His days on the force were over. That much was certain. His name had been dragged through the media, his face plastered across screens, his safety threatened more than once. But as he sat alone, staring at the quiet ring of his phone, Wade felt something crack open inside him, something clean and painful, and necessary. For once he wasn't running from what he'd done. For once he was facing it head on. At City Hall, Dean Barrett's office stood empty. His quiet resignation had been submitted just hours before the Oversight Committee announced its plans for sweeping reforms: independent review boards, public complaint tracking, mandatory body cams, racial bias training. The mayor stood before the cameras, her voice firm and rehearsed, promising a new era of transparency and accountability. But in the streets, the people knew this wasn't the end. It was just a beginning. Weeks later, Shaq stood on stage at a community town hall, not under the bright lights of an arena or the flash of cameras, but in the heart of the neighborhood where Belle's incident had sparked a national movement. He wore no suit, no jersey, just a simple shirt and jeans, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "We didn't get here because one person made a speech," Shaq said, his voice deep and clear. "We got here because people stood up. People who were tired of waiting, tired of hoping, tired of surviving. We got here because Belle stood up. Because all of you stood up." He paused, scanning the room, seeing faces of all ages, all backgrounds, all unified by a shared demand for better. "And we can't stop here. This is the start, not the finish line. This is about building something that lasts." From the front row, Belle smiled faintly. Baby Lucille nestled against her chest. She'd fought to be here, to be part of this, and every time she looked at her daughter, she felt the pull of something bigger than herself, a legacy she hadn't chosen, but one she now embraced. Later that night, Shaq sat alone in his living room, the weight of the last few months finally settling into his bones. He stared at the photographs on the mantle: Belle as a little girl, Lucille holding newborn Shaq, the team championship moments frozen in time. For so long, his life had been defined by wins and losses, trophies and endorsements, moments of triumph measured in points and contracts. But now, none of that seemed to matter. What mattered was the ground they'd shaken together, the doors they'd pushed open, the promises they'd made to the next generation. He picked up his phone, scrolling through messages, notes from activists, community leaders, even young athletes who'd reached out, inspired by his stand. Shaq felt a mix of humility and responsibility settle deeper in his chest. This was no longer about his name. It was about the people behind the headlines, the stories that didn't always make the news, the fights still waiting to be fought. In a small corner of the city, Wade Sullivan quietly packed a duffel bag, preparing to leave town for a while, unsure of what came next. But even as he zipped the bag closed, he paused, pulling his old badge from the dresser and staring at it one last time. He slipped it into the bag, not out of pride, but as a reminder of the man he'd been, the mistakes he'd made, and the work still ahead. Back at the O'Neill home, Belle rocked Lucille gently, the baby's soft breaths a lullaby against her shoulder. Nate watched them, his hand resting lightly on Belle's back, his heart full despite the scars left by the fight. And Shaq, standing at the window, gazed out over the city, a city that had erupted, demanded, and begun at last to change. He knew it wasn't over. He knew there were more battles ahead. But he also knew something fundamental had shifted. A single strike on one woman's belly had rung through the entire nation, and its echo would not be silenced. If this story stirred something in you, don't let the conversation stop here. Talk about it with your family, your friends, your community. Change begins when we face what's hard together. Share the message, carry it forward, and be part of the movement for dignity and justice. The voices in this story echo far beyond the screen. Make sure they echo through your world too. Because real impact doesn't end when the credits roll. That's exactly where it starts.